The level of integration of CSR, when you look at companies, what would be the main categories? And so the first very simple approach I saw was, three stages. When you look at businesses, when you look at companies in Europe, I'd say stage one is philanthropy, more or less. We talked about that, and I think this is still a very important number of companies. In strategy, also they're called either sometimes the silent ones, the sleepers. They look at CSR and say, wait and see. And then second step, this is the most common approach to CSR today, is compliance. CSR means, we have to comply with requirements. It could be legal requirements, of course, but it could be also pressures. So I would say CSR most of the time today is a reactive approach. Companies respond to either, as I was saying, regulation, legal constraints, or they respond to customer pressure, to the sector-based pressure. This is something that has been going on, obviously, in many sectors, that when there's an early mover in this field, then the whole sector starts to respond and needs to comply with the early mover. Or it can be from other stakeholders. So unfortunately, I would say for the moment, CSR is still viewed in a reactive way, as something which, we have to respond. What are we going to do? Yes?
Excuse me, are questions allowed?
Yeah, why not? Sure.
Do you think, because social pressure is very relevant in the evolution of CSR strategies, I think both in the US and in Europe, and as you said earlier, in the developing countries, CSR is not as evolved because social pressure is not as strong. What do you think about that?
Okay, now, two things. One thing is, I don't want to be ranking countries and say CSR is much more. I'm very cautious about that. My idea is not to say, we in Europe are so great,
No,
not at all.
I didn't
CSR is a complex issue. The second thing I would say is that depending on the local context, the pressures will come from different angles, you see. So it's hard to say what does social pressure mean, for instance. It can be also for companies, in a lot of developing countries, CSR may be linked to the fact that if the company wants to enter, the European market, it needs to adjust to certain requirements like ISO 14001 to start with, or other issues, and that would be pressure. That's another pressure, market pressure.
Sure.
So it's a very complicated, it's a very complicated matter. You may have in developing countries, I think, very good examples, best practices,
yes, sure.
and very, very bad behaviors in developed countries. Yes. So it's hard. That's what I would say for the moment. Okay, if we go on, third level, which I think is the relevant level, is when CSR becomes a proactive stance. That is when companies think of CSR in a strategic way, either to have a competitive advantage, which, by the way, Michael Porter, showed in the 90s when he started working on environmental regulation, for instance, or social regulation, and showing that finally this could bring the company competitive advantage. As I was saying, the father of modern capitalism of the 80s that thinks that CSR is good for companies. That's interesting. So this is one example, but anyway, let's say, to turn, as I often say in a simple way, to turn constraints into opportunities. That is, how can you, because let's face it, most of the time those are new constraints. New costs, transaction costs, information costs, all kinds of costs. It's a new burden. But how can you turn that into an opportunity? I think this is one way for companies to really think of CSR in a positive and constructive way and move ahead. So those are three levels we can approach. Another simple